We live in a little community on the Guadalupe River. I refer to Waring, Texas, my home, as being a suburb of Comfort, Texas. This church was on one of the only paved streets in Waring, and it happened to be right across the street from the ranch where we live. And I was always just drawn to this church. It was a Baptist church, has a lot of history. It was built in 1895, and it just, all of the members eventually died off except for a couple of them, and I didn't know what was going to happen to the church, but it was lovely, and it's just hard to beat. You can't drive down this street and not look at this church and go, wow, I wonder what it looks like inside. When the church disbanded, they would rent this church to different non-denominational ministers, preachers, and I tried to buy it. And the people that had the church offered to give it to me, but it had a stipulation, and the stipulation was I had to promise them that we would have service here on Sundays. And that was just beyond the pale. I mean, there was no way I could do that, and they wouldn't sell it to me. So another group of folks came along and wound up with the church, and they were having service here every Sunday. Consequently, they gave the church to them. They deeded them the church. Well, that church disbanded and they owned it, and I heard about it, and I made a deal and bought it. I felt that it was something, and it was very run down at the time. They used it, but maybe they didn't have the funds to restore it. And I was concerned about that. I didn't want it to just continue to deteriorate. My son and I, Jason and I, bought the church in 2018. And for 2019, we spent restoring the church and getting it to the condition that it is today. The thing that I cherish the most about my childhood would be where I was fortunate enough to be raised. Mitchell County, Texas, west of Abilene, a little town called Colorado City, Texas. Small town. Everyone knew everyone. Wonderful place to grow up. No regrets. As a child, there were several people that impacted my life. But the number one was my father. I was very close to my father, and he was a man of integrity, but he also had a lot of soul. I've got to explain the very first exposure to music that I had, and obviously it was in the church. While living in Anson, we had a sort of a different makeup in religion with my parents. We had a little disagreement of where we should go. My father was Church of Christ and my mother was a Baptist. And consequently, they never reconciled a family church. I had an older sister, and one Sunday I would go with my father and my sister would go with my mother. And the next Sunday I would go with my mother and my sister would go with my father. And I just remember how interesting it was in the Church of Christ with no musical instruments. The first music that I was inspired by that just interested me so deeply was, I heard it one Saturday afternoon when I was at my dad's dealership. You could hear the music, or I could hear the music coming from the wash rack. And it was like nothing I had ever heard. I mean, it was, it sounded kind of like gospel, but it didn't sound like the church because it had this guitar that was making these sounds that I'd never heard before. And of course, I rode my back out there, and sure enough, there was one of the guys that worked for my dad. His name was DeWitt Bender, and he was washing his car. He had a record player in the car, and he was playing blues music, and that is really what kind of turned my ear, rather than what most kids were listening to conventionally. It certainly wasn't the blues at home, and that's where my first inspiration came from. Keep in mind that I'm a baby boomer. So my first exposure to music was 1956, 57. What has changed from that time, fast forward to the generation of today's music, it is light years. You know, you could buy a reel-to-reel, you could buy a 45, you could buy an LP. There was no computer. Today, you download. We have satellite radio. LPs are making a comeback right now, but it's a novelty thing. Writing songs is it's a creativity that comes from deep within. There's two kinds of writers, in my opinion. There's those who are so creative that they can read a magazine and get an idea, or they can look through the phone book and get an idea. They can just grab these ideas, you know, just out of midair and go with it and walk out of the room with a song that just literally came from nowhere. I, on the other hand, have never been a writer from that point of view. I have to have something that inspires me to write a song. My musical career started on a professional level in 1971, and I gave it my all until 1982. And I had two goals in life. One of my goals was I wanted to have a family. I wanted to be a father several years earlier than my father was. I wanted to be here longer for my children. And I kind of walked away from music. My music was the most important thing in my life. Well, I realized when we started a family that the most important thing in my life was my children. And it completely changed my life. And about the time that I'm redlined in being a father, then I become a grandfather, and to go from that level of just that feeling to have grandchildren it's just off the chart. I mean, there's nothing more important than my children, their spouses, my wife, and our grandchildren. My second goal was to outlive my father, and I'm 2 years ahead of him right now, so I've reached my goals. It's time to set another one.